For our project, we're going to be working with watercolor. And one of the first steps you need to do when working with watercolor is become familiar with the material. So for this part of the project, we're going to experiment with watercolor and some different techniques that we can do with the watercolor itself. So what you'll need is a piece of sketchbook paper. You will need your watercolor set. And notice I've already added some water to each of my colors so that my pigments start softening up. It'll make it easier to work with. You'll want some paper towel. You'll want a dish of water. You may want some extra paint brushes, though the one that comes with the set should be enough to work with, but you may want some extras of different sizes. You may want to experiment with some fun things, so definitely one would be table salt. So you'll want a little bit of table salt during this. Some other things you can work with is possibly a sponge. So any type of sponge could work for this. You may want some sandpaper, and especially if you have watercolor pencils, and watercolor pencils are made specifically to work with water, so you can't just use any type of pencil or color pencil. You need watercolor pencils. So that may be something, if you have it, that you would want to experiment with. You may want some sort of object that will allow you to create other textures, and I'm going to use a popsicle stick for that. Some things I'm going to demonstrate to you. And we're ready to begin experimenting with our watercolors. So the first thing I want to talk about is consistency of the watercolor. We don't want our watercolor to be thick. We want it to have a translucent quality to it. So when I work with watercolor, and that's why I pre-wet my colors so that they have a chance to start softening, I will put some water on my paintbrush, and I'll just pick up a little bit of watercolor, and then I'm going to test it. So when it comes to your project, even, you may want to test this out on a sheet of paper other than your project. So I'm going to apply some of that watercolor I picked up, and that's not too bad of a consistency. I can still see the glow of the white paper through the pigment. It's not super thick and dark. Personally, I like my watercolors a little bit thinner than that, so that means I would pick up a little bit more water in my paintbrush and work with this so that it's a little bit thinner in consistency. So you can see the difference here between the two. This one has a little bit more water, this one has a little bit more pigment. If you don't have that slight glow of the white paper through there, if it just looks like tempera paint or acrylic paint applied to your paper, then you're working with your watercolor a little bit too thick and you want to add more water. So when we apply watercolor in a solid feel like this on dry paper, first of all, that technique is called wet on dry, meaning we took wet paint and applied it to dry paper, and these are also called washes. Solid feel of watercolor applied to the paper. So since there is a wet on dry technique, that means there is also a technique called wet on wet. And that involves wetting the paper first. So I'm going to make sure my paintbrush is clean, and I'm going to pick up some water, and I'm going to apply it to the surface of my paper. So this is just clean water applied to my paper. Once I have water applied to my paper, I'm going to apply some wet paint on top of there. So notice what happens as soon as I touch some paint on there. It immediately flooded the wet area. And if you look into the middle there, we get what we call bleeding. And bleeding is when the wet paper, which will absorb wet material easier because it is already saturated with liquid, pulls that pigment into its wet fibers. So you notice on our wet on dry over here how clean those edges are, and if you look here where I touched my wet paint on the wet paper, how fuzzy they are. So that is one of the unique things about wet on wet technique, is the look of the edges when we apply the wet paint to the wet paper. You'll also notice though, when that pigment flooded out, and since my paper is buckling, that's why it went to these outer edges, because the paper is swelling up in the middle. Notice that that pigment stopped where my wet areas on my paper are. It didn't bleed over into any other section. It stayed contained where the wet water was on the paper. So this is my wet on wet technique. Okay, so there are other things you can do with this. Just using a combination of these two. I could apply a wash of a color onto, and look, I can tell already that that's really thick. I can barely see my bristles through that paint, so I'm going to try to scrape as much of that back off into my palette, and I'm going to dip my paintbrush into water, and already I can start to see a little bit more bristles. So I'm going to apply a wash of a color. So I'm working with wet on dry right now. But then I can come over top of that, or add to that, some paint of another color. So if I tried some yellow, I can pick up some yellow, I can dab it on, I can paint it on, and notice that that yellow will kind of push the wet paint underneath the side, and it starts to turn into more green colors because it's starting to mix on my paper and in the wet fibers. So you can use wet on wet technique with two pigments. You don't have to just work on white paper and wet paint. Going further with that, I could start with just my wet paper, and if I wanted something that had kind of a blotchy, fuzzy look but with multiple colors other than just one, I could then just come in and pick up different colors. I can again tap them on, I can paint them on, but I can let them bleed and mix together on my paper. To create many different looks with this. So again, this is a wash with a color in the wet on wet technique. And this is a wet on wet. And it's just multiple colors. Excuse me. So going with just these basic techniques, for this next couple, you'll want a piece of paper towel. And you can kind of squish it up. You may, if you have available to you, want a sponge, and you will want it damp, not soaking wet, but damp. And one other fun thing you could possibly use is some plastic. So I'm going to grab a piece of plastic here to work with. Okay, so this is a plastic bag. You can use saran wrap. Either will work. Saran wrap, in fact, works a little bit better, but unfortunately, I don't have any with me right now. So we're going to experiment a little bit with a plastic bag. So I'm going to start with some color down on my paper. And while this is still wet, I want to use my paper towel. So I'm going to come in with some watercolor, apply my wash, and while this is wet, I want to take my paper towel and just kind of stab at that area where I've just painted. So you see how it picks up some of the pigment, dries out my paint a little bit faster, and yet it creates a fun little texture that kind of picks up the wrinkles from the paper towel all squished together. So that I'm going to label as my paper towel. And I like to label these as I work with them, because in that way, if it's a technique I end up liking that I experimented with, then I have it written down what it was exactly I did, so that when it comes to working in my project, I know exactly what materials I need. So I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to use my dampened sponge. So I'm going to again apply some wash to my paper. And I'm going to take my sponge and again kind of stab and dab at that. Now another fun thing is, and you could probably even do this with the paper towel, we see a little bit of it there. Since I have some pigment in my sponge from doing that, I can then spread that paint out using the sponge, or I can just try to contain it in the area I was working with to create a little bit of a splotchy effect with the color. And I'm going to try my plastic bag here to see how well it works. Now again, saran wrap does work better because you would be able to keep the plastic over top of the watercolor until it dries. So this might not work too well for this experiment, but let's give it a try. So I'm going to pick a color. And I'm going to apply a wash. And while that is wet, I'm going to take some of my plastic bag. I'm going to lay it down and let it kind of mush on there. And again, it is thick, so it's probably not going to stay, but let's try a little bit of tape. Let's see if my tape will stick this down a little bit better. Put some tape there. Gather this up a little bit more. Put a little piece of tape here. And just something so that that will kind of rest up against that watercolor while it dries. Alright, we'll see if that works. I'm not sure if it will. Again, saran wrap does work better. It's a thinner material. It rests easier over top of your watercolors. but we'll give it a try, see if it does work. Okay? And that's what this is all about, experimenting, seeing what works. So I want to make sure I label this as sponge, because that's what I use to create that, and this is going to be plastic. Okay, so moving on to some other possibilities that I can use with my watercolor. And a lot of these techniques will involve wet paint. You have a few that you can go back and work on with dry paint or with dry paper. So I'm again going to create a wash, and since I spilled a little bit of watercolor in my watercolor set, I'm going to use some of that up. And that's really thick. So I'm going to clean out my paintbrush. And I'm going to try to add more water to that to thin out that wash, so it's not quite as much pigment into my water mixture. And while this is wet, I'm going to take my popsicle stick and just use the edge of it and run through my watercolor. And what happens is I scratch the fibers of my paper, and so that wet watercolor pigment is gathering in those areas where I've scratched the fibers. If I let this dry a little bit, and down here it might work, and I scrape over it, I get a white line, because what I'm doing is I'm scraping some of the pigment away. So if it's too wet, it's going to create a dark mark. If it's dry though, it's going to lift a little bit of that watercolor off of there. Now what I want to be careful though when I do this is because wet paper is delicate. I can't come in and make a bunch of scratches or be really rough with it, because then I'll end up tearing a hole in my paper. But that is a technique in which you can use to add some texture or interest to your watercolor. One of the most fun techniques that a lot of people like is using salt. So you'll want some table salt for this. And again, I'm going to start with a wash of color. So I'm going to pick up some of my red and apply a wash. And I'm going to sprinkle some salt over top of that wet watercolor. And this one, like the plastic wrap, is going to have to sit a while it dries. Before I do anything else to it, it has to dry. So let's make sure we label here. This is popsicle stick, and this is salt. So now that my first two washes are dry here, I'm going to demonstrate to you what you can do up here with a dry area. You can come in and apply some clean water to it, and I like to gently, wiggle my paintbrush around, get the bristles to help work that pigment up. And what it's going to do is, if I dry it a little bit and come back to that same area, it's going to lift some of the color up. If I try it over here where it's a little bit of a darker pigment, or if I try to paint over an area that's been dried, you can get these little splotches in it. So what do I mean by splotches is it softens the paint back up, and your bristles will want to absorb some of that pigment. But it will also push some of that re-wet pigment out towards the edges of that water. So you can see it a little bit more in this darker version. It's starting to happen. You start to get this dark ring around here. So that is another way in which you can add texture. You can come back to things that are dry just add some water to them. You can experiment if you gently work the bristles into the watercolor. If you just tap a little bit of water on there, what's going to happen to that area that already has dry. Okay, so whereas that was a wet on wet wash, we've now added some water splotches. So we have both going on there. For this next technique, if you have some watercolor pencils, you'll also want some sandpaper. And this creates another nice little texture. So I'm working with a blue watercolor pencil, so I'm going to want something that's going to allow the blue to show up. So I'm going to go in with some yellow. And I'm going to apply it to my paper. And while this is wet, I want to take my sandpaper and my watercolor pencil and just grind some watercolor pencil on top of that wet paint. So since watercolor pencil, like watercolors, are activated with wetness, with water, if it's a really wet area, you'll start to see it kind of bleed out, soften up, blend out a little bit more. And if it's a little bit drier of an area, you're going to notice those speckles stay a little bit better in our area. So this is also a technique you can possibly use. So this is watercolor pencil and wet watercolor. And anytime you paint, you can also place wet paint on top of wet paint, as we showed up here. You can create gradients that way. But if you have your table work area protected, whether it's wet on wet or wet on dry, you could have little bits of splatter. So again, you want to protect your work area. You don't want to get watercolor paint everywhere. But if I just pick up a little bit of paint and I just gently tap my paintbrush over my paper, so you can see if it's a wet area, you're going to get very defined speckles, kind of similar to what we did here with watercolor pencil. But if it's a wet area, it's going to soften up, bleed out. And you can do that with single colors, or you can do it with multiple colors. So if I wanted to add some blue in with my green, I can add a little bit of blue speckle on there. So this is splatter. And again, I can't stress it enough. Make sure you cover your work area before you do that, so you don't end up with a mess all over. So those are some fun and exciting ways that you can experiment with watercolor. Play around with some of these ideas. Play around with some of your own. Practice mixing some colors. And I do suggest, if you want to mix colors, that you use something other than your watercolor set. Sometimes when you use your watercolor set up here for that tray that comes with it in the lid, you forget that you have wet watercolor up there, and then you close this and it ends up mixed all inside your watercolors. So I usually keep something else with me when I mix colors. So I'll use a styrofoam plate, or I've used the plastic lid to a butter bowl. something that isn't a good item, so you don't want to get out a dinner plate and use this for mixing. But just remember some general rules that you should have been learning since elementary school when mixing colors is that you usually want to start with your lightest color first and add small amounts of the darker color to it. So if I wanted to make a yellow green, I'd start with some yellow, and then I'm going to pick up the bare minimum amount of green and mix into it. And the reason is when you mix colors, you try to add little bits at a time, is because you want to control how much of a pigment is going into your mixture. And especially with yellow, since it's a very light color, it will get overtaken by other colors very quickly. So I want to slowly mix in some of another color in there. And then I can apply it, so we can see down here my yellow green pigment compared to my yellow and my green out of the set, what it looks like. So that's one way you can mix up colors also, other than just on the paper, is what I've demonstrated a lot here with playing around with watercolor techniques. You can mix them, and the nice thing is if you use something like this, and if you've mixed up a lot of color because you're using it for your project, you can just let it dry. And then since it's watercolor, just like our watercolor sets, you can just add some water to it and reactivate it to use it. So one thing about watercolors that is definitely nice is that you can let them set and dry, and unlike other paints, they will be usable when you come back to them. You just have to reactivate them with some water. So experiment, play around, have a little bit of fun with your watercolors. Try out some techniques. Don't be afraid to mess up. This is just practice. And that is what you were assigned today. Just play around, have fun, experiment mixing colors, experiment working with different tools, experiment with different applications of the watercolor, both wet, both dry, and turn that assignment in.